The following information and opinions expressed on the Sweet Divorce podcast do not constitute, nor are intended to be taken as legal advice. All content is generalized and for informational purposes only. Please contact our legal team or your own attorney for advice specific to your particular case. Thank you.
It's Sweet Divorce.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Sweet Divorce Podcast from Burgos Santoyo Smith. I am Rosario Santoyo, and this is my partner,
Gretel Smith.
We're joined today with Elizabeth Mayberry, our attorney in Monterey, California. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Rosario.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. It's a nice sunny day here in Monterey.
Today, we're going to be talking about military divorces, particularly. Elizabeth also has a military spouse, and there are a lot of things that affect military divorces differently than they affect regular divorces. So one of the things that we were going to discuss today with Elizabeth was why active duty military tend to have a higher divorce rate than traditional marriages.
And so to kind of understand that concept, you need to understand why military families are a little bit different. What are the kind of impacts and things that they deal with on a daily basis? And according to the US Census, they have found that people that serve in the military have the highest rate of divorce of any career field. So why does that happen? So the biggest thing that you hear in military is the deployments, the periods of separation. That does put a lot of strain on a relationship. It does impact the ability to care for children and kind of that support network of the families. Typically, these marriages are also younger. You typically get married younger because the military does not recognize girlfriends or significant others unless you are married. So people tend to get married a lot younger. You do have some mental health issues that come from being in the military that are impacted coming back from deployments. And you do have a lot of caregiver difficulties. These are families that are constantly moving, constantly told that they have to go across the country or somewhere else in the world. And you don't have that support network. So everywhere you're going, you're rebuilding that support from anything from childcare to just be able to take care while you go to work as the other spouse. So there are these difficulties that create kind of this problems that come into play when you start getting into the divorce realm of how do you deal with all of these complications because of the impact that the military has on your life.
So how, if you were in the military, what's the best way to start a divorce while you're in the military?
So there's two different sides of it. So I kind of want to start with looking solely at that service member. So first, it depends for the service member on if you're wanting to get divorced, where do you go? And that does create some complications because of different things at play. If you don't have a child, it makes things a little bit easier. Typically, you're looking at where you're currently living is where you would be filing. Some things such as your pension may come into play depending on what your home state of residence is. A lot of people that are not military don't understand that concept. So your home state of residence is where you tell the military that that's where you live. Because again, they're moving you all around the country. You really don't have that true home base because they're moving you. And so a lot of people, they claim their home state of residence. That's actually where they file taxes. They may not file taxes in where they're currently living. But for the divorce process, you're going to look at the place you currently are for the process, unless there's some other factor that you could talk with your attorney about, which would make sense in filing another state. And kind of what I mean by the UCJEA and when you have kids. Kids are the biggest thing that you're going to see in divorces that cause a little bit more complications because you're moving so often. The UCJEA is the Uniform Child Custody and Jurisdiction Enforcement Act. And this is looking at where were your kids the last 6 months, what's their home state. The problem is when you're military, you may be moving every 2 to 3 years or even more frequent than that, where you may have issues there. And that's why you would want to talk to an attorney sooner rather than later to know where actually you want to file. Because it can make a difference. A month can make a difference on where you would file, depending on if you get moved to another station. If your spouse is going to have to get stationed overseas, where these complications come up, and that's kind of where you want to get started on the process.
You bring up a very good point. I do have more questions about where command would play in all of this.
So there are some things. So before you get into a court, there are things that a military command can put into place in order to make sure that the spouse or the or even the service member are taken care of through this divorce process. If you need and are a spouse that is not the one that's receiving the income, maybe you're stay-at-home mom and the service member is withholding income from you and you need it to support yourself. You can go and actually talk to the JAG on base or talk to the command and be able to get their commanding officer to order them to provide you funding until the civil court is able to take over. Depending on which branch, there are different calculations on what that amount would be, but that would help ensure that you're able to get something to be able to take care of the family until you're able to get into that civil court. Also, as well, they may be able to get housing for either the out spouse or the service member if they cannot live under the same roof. The service member may be able to live in the barracks or some sort of housing on base until everything's able to get sorted out.
What other special areas should military families be considering when they are looking into getting divorce or separation?
So a lot of it does apply to what's in their family. Of course, custody is going to be a big consideration. Where specifically are you going to live? Are both spouses service members where you're going to have the complication of who's going to have the kids if somebody's deployed? One area that most service members should be familiar with, but it does apply in family law cases, is the SCRA, the Service Member Civil Relief Act. This has been an act that's been in place for many years. If there's a case that is started and you are deployed, you're not available to participate in the action. SCRA does protect you in those cases where you can essentially get a stay of the proceedings until you're able to return and be able to make your arguments before the court. For example, I have a service member that I represent, and he deployed middle of the proceedings. He was not able to appear because his commanding officer would not let him take off. They're going to deploy over somewhere overseas, and he can't be able to appear. So we were able to file a stay and get the proceeding stayed until his return, because it's going to significantly impact his ability to represent himself. And what's wonderful in San Diego, they have a wonderful pro bono program down there that does assist service members. If they don't know about the action, they will reach out if they know that you are a service member to make sure that their rights are protected. But then your attorney as well can help assist in that process to ensure that you get all of your rights.
I have a question about deployment and how that might affect custody. Because if military service members are more prone to be deployed, does that mean that it's harder for them to have custody when they're actually present?
So in California, we have a statute that says if it is solely for the purpose of deployment, that does not have any impact on your rights to care for the child. There are potentially some temporary things that could go into place, such as dad's deployed or mom's deployed, the other parent would be the caregiver while you are away. But unless there's some other factor involved, such as one parent lives 3 hours away, it doesn't make sense to change the schooling. Typically, it would revert right back to the same custody orders you had prior to deployment. And again, every family is different, so you have to, of course, look at those structure. But if you're living in the same town, your kid would go to the same school, and the only difference is you're deploying, they should not be changing anything beyond a temporary order for while you are gone.
If you're a service member, this is just a question that came to mind. What sort of things should you do to prepare, for example, for your divorce more so? Like not just talking to your command, but what are some things that you would advise a service member who's seeking a divorce from their non-service member spouse to do to prepare for that?
So there's, I think, a couple different things. One, you want to start kind of getting together your finances, because it can become more complicated if you move on getting some of these documentations when you are away. A big consideration that a lot of service members think about is their pension. Back in 2017, there was a huge change in the pension program from the legacy program into this new blended program. And so a lot of service members, sometimes their biggest asset is their pension. And depending on your state, that can have a huge impact on how the courts actually understand and divide that pension. Most service members know the 10-year rule. The 10-year rule is if you've been married for 10 years, the military will actually, the DFAS itself, which is the Defense Financial, can't think of the rest of the acronym right now, but it's the DFAS is the organization. Once you hit 10 years, if you were to divorce, they would divide your pension and facilitate all of the transactions, where prior to 10 years, some states will not actually permit that to be divided. And in California, you have to put in your initial pleadings whether you are saying the court has jurisdiction to your pension or not. And especially with it being the biggest asset, if you're somebody under a 10-year marriage, that may make a huge impact on whether the pension actually gets divided or not, depending on your home state of residence.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Regarding support, I know that military members also get additional stipends, or I don't know if they're classified as stipends, but the BAH and BAS. And some of them are non-taxable. Is that income considered in child support?
So for child support, the statutes in here, California, again, it may vary other states, but we're California attorneys, they will consider it as a base of support. What you're talking about is BAH, which is your basic housing allowance, and BAS, which is your living stipend in some sense to help deal with it. You may also see things on there such as COLA, which is your cost of living adjustment. You may see uniform allowances, various different things that will show up on there. So yes, they are considered part of support. And that sometimes service members don't always realize that that will also be included in there. Especially if you're living in military housing, you don't get that cash. That all goes towards directly paying for that housing. And so you're kind of left with, oh, how do I actually afford this? The courts are able to make some deference on those issues if you do raise that concern. But again, it's considered part of the calculations. But that also means you may have to seek for modification more frequently than other people with support. Because if you move to a new duty station, just for example, going from California to the Virginia area, it's almost a $2,000 difference for just BAH because of the difference in the housing market.
Yeah,
So you potentially would need to seek a modification because your income is drastically changing, not for anything beyond of your command is just moving you to a new duty station.
And just for military service members to know, if it was open in California and they move, where would they file that modification?
So there's kind of two questions for that. The first question would be, where is the child and the other parent? If the child is still living in California, you could still file here and have the modification done here in California. If everyone leaves the state of California, you're looking either at the resident of the payor, which would be who is actually paying the support, or you're looking at the residence of the child to kind of make that determination. But again, if everyone if there's still a child and still that at least one parent in California, you can still have the modification done here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any other parting words for us?
The best thing I can say is that divorce is complicated for everyone, but especially for service members. And so it's better to get kind of started earlier on the process and getting all your ducks in a row before you have some of these more complicated things come up with a move. Something the service members should consider is move away orders. Again, a lot of different things that are getting thrown at, but if you're going to have to move to a duty station, you need to plan more ahead because there's a lot of different things that go into play with a move for custody orders. And so again, the biggest piece of advice is plan early and plan often.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. If you find yourself in need of an attorney, please feel free to reach out to us, Rosario Santoyo Smith, Inc. at 833-931-1615.
Thank you. Life is sweeter after divorce. Let us help you get there.